Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello everyone, welcome back to Keen on America. We're breaking our rules today. We generally only have American guests, but we have an honorary American. He was actually born in Britain and talking to us from Australia, where he now lives in Sydney. Nick Bryant will be familiar to all of you. He was the BBC's man in Washington for many years, and he has a new book out, The Forever War. He has had a long-term love affair with America. And Nick, before we get to The Forever War, where maybe perhaps you're falling out of love a little bit with America, you might explain how you, as a young man, I think as a 16-year-old, you fell in love with America.
Oh, Andrew, I came to America for the first time on the eve of the Los Angeles Olympics, and it was such an extraordinary summer, a summertime of American resurgence, of course, after the long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis. The summer of '84 was when America really got its mojo back with that gold rush in LA. You remember the Soviets boycotted. America seemed to win gold medals in everything. The USA chant just went from shore to shore. I remember there was a McDonald's scratch card promotion at the time. If you got a gold in America, you got a Big Mac. A silver got you fries. A bronze got you a big Coke. And America was winning winning golds in events that McDonald's never predicted, like Greco-Roman wrestling. And I was just eating out for free for that entire summer. In fact, whenever I hear the chant USA, USA, I expect somebody to hand me a free hamburger. But it was an amazing time. And of course, Ronald Reagan encapsulated that spirit in his re-election slogan. It's morning again in America. It was an amazing time to be there. And one of the things I reflect on now is how do we go from it's morning again in America, the optimism of that time, to the American carnage that we see today?
We might remind ourselves, Nick, again, you don't need me to tell you this. I know you've written a PhD in American history, that the 70s were a pretty gruesome time. We had Helen Thompson on the show, a distinguished British academic. She's written extensively about the 70s. Inflation, Carter, Nixon, Watergate, mass violence in American cities, the aftermath of the civil rights, enormous racial animosity and tension. So what we're going through today, and we're going to get to The Forever War, your thesis in your new book, it's happened before, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think people often forget about that. People often think about American exceptionalism being the continual thread of American history, this idea that America is superior and things have always been good and getting better. But there's always been a sense of American decline as well. I loved your intro, where it went through those 250 years of history, because this really is a 250-year story. That's what my book is all about, locating a lot of the problems of the here and now in the origins of America. And right at the beginning, there was a fear that the United States of America itself would not be a viable concept. I mean, victory over the British brought about independence, but it didn't bring about instant nationhood. And I think a lot of people forget that. One of the reasons why George Washington agreed reluctantly to become president was because he feared the splintering of the Union, even before it had become a union. The Constitution, in many ways, was an agreement to keep disagreeing. And we saw that same sense of doomsmongering in the 1970s. As you say, you had Watergate, you had the legacy of the 1960s with the violence of the civil rights era, the assassinations of JFK, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You had stagflation. You had a president in Jimmy Carter who was seen as a little bit weak and a little bit frail. He turned white.
And more than a little bit, Nick, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know,
he cardigan and the Iranian hostage crisis.
Yeah, exactly. He made the White House a little bit suburban, didn't he, with those cardigans?
He
And he
shrank
went
it.
around turning off the lights and all those kind of things. He sort of limited the number of presidential limousines. And remember, the presidential motorcade is always a sort of symbol of American power. And like Gerald Ford, he got rid of "Hail to the Chief" when the president walks in the room, and he had to bring it back. Carter realized that Americans love that pomp. They love that circumstance. They like the idea of a strongman president, and he wasn't seen as a strongman president. But also worth remembering, Andrew, that Reagan in the early years was on the nose as well. The Republicans hadn't done very well in the midterm elections in 1982. Indeed, the New York Times was editorializing, wondering whether Reagan would even stand in 1984. But there was this amazing turnaround, and I witnessed it for myself, a recovery of national confidence at a level of national confidence, frankly, that you just don't see today.
When one thinks of the forever war, Nick, when did this begin? The subtitle is America's Unending Conflict with Itself. You mentioned the origins of the Republic, which itself was a kind of civil war between British settlers and the British colonial state in London. Americans were always divided about the kind of state it was. There's huge amounts of disagreement between Federalists and anti-Federalists. Then, of course, you have the Civil War. So was America ever united?
Well,
Did you ever have I'm sorry to be so cliched here, but I can't resist. Was there ever a United States of America?
Well, I think that terminology was quite interesting. You know, rather than calling it a United State of America, they called it the United States of America. American exceptionalism wasn't a thing at the beginning. It was Virginian exceptionalism and Massachusetts exceptionalism. The New Englanders thought they were superior. The Virginians thought they were superior. It was quite a long time.
They still do. You've been to Boston. They always.
That's absolutely right. Hang out in Harvard Square for a while, and you'll still get that sense, obviously. And it took a long while before there was a real sense of national consciousness. And as I say, I mean, one of the reasons why Washington decided to be president was because he really worried that this project really wouldn't get off the ground in the first place. And of course, there were these huge divides at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, especially over the question of slavery. Again, the Constitution was this agreement to keep on disagreeing on that issue. They kind of fudged it. And that was a fault line that was always likely to erupt and explode. And of course it did in the Civil War in the 1860s. Then they had this period of Reconstruction. It wasn't a coming together at all. The South hated the occupation as they saw it by federal troops. And then you saw the era of Jim Crow, an American South that was segregated and a North that wasn't. You had two Americas back then as well. So it really has been a story of continual division. Indeed, division is America's default. And we shouldn't be surprised that America hasn't got a sense of oneness today, because frankly, it really hasn't for much of its history.
And you even mentioned the genocide against Native American peoples. We've done many shows on that. That's an injustice that has been pretty much swept under many carpets, at least. I wonder, Nick, whether one could argue, you've written a whole book about this forever war, whether American energy, the dynamic of America, is driven by this division. Had America always been more united, then perhaps it wouldn't have had such a remarkable, and continues to have, a remarkable economic and cultural history. The politics may not be great, but everything else is good.
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant point, actually. And I do address that in the book. There's a kind of America's almost politics proof to a certain extent. And actually, some of the fault lines, some of the problems that have bedeviled the country over the years are exactly the things that have made it better. I mean, you think about immigration, that from the beginning, the very beginning, immigration has been a contentious issue. Who should become American? Who should be we the people? There's been nativism throughout American history. That, again, has been a continual thread. But where would America be today without its immigrant population? I mean, it's immigrants that have often brought the great energy and animation to America. It's been a massive plus, even though politically it has been a big problem. You think about race, again, African Americans perfected the Union in many ways. It was their campaigning in the civil rights movement, especially in the post-war years, that finally brought America to the point of universal suffrage. I think that's often forgotten. It wasn't really until 1965, with the passage of the landmark Voting Rights Act, that America really achieved universal suffrage. Americans in the South, Black Americans, could finally vote. They weren't subjected to these ridiculous literacy tests and poll taxes and white primaries and a level of intimidation. And it was African Americans who kind of made the union more perfect. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful point to make, that often the problems of America have contributed to the amazing brilliance of America.
Yeah, it's a country with a glittering history, but also a very dark underside. You've traveled the world, Nick. You've reported everywhere. You've spent time in Southeast Asia. You live in Australia. Is America really exceptional in that sense? Don't all countries have a dark underbelly that they don't like to talk about, a history of race or exploitation, colonialism? I mean, the Europeans also are guilty of many of these great crimes.
Absolutely, no question about it. But I think what's different about America, certainly today, in the here and now, is how the extent to which it contests its history. I think that's one of the things that does set America apart at the moment. That's what makes America exceptional. So much of the history is unresolved. In a way, perhaps it isn't so much in other countries. Sure, there's a lot of unresolved history here in Australia. There's a lot of unresolved history in Britain, some of the Europeans. But it doesn't dominate contemporary political debate in the same way that it does in America. I mean, just a few examples. People in America are still arguing over the meaning of the Second Amendment. The 14th Amendment informs debates about citizenship. It informs debates about affirmative action. It informs debate about whether Trump should even be able to stand in the presidential election because of his role on January the 6th. Race is that constant curse, as Bill Clinton called it once, that America just can't seem to get over. The hope was that a black president would sort of absolve America of the original sin of racism and slavery. But who followed him into the White House? Donald Trump, a white nationalist racist. So I don't know a country that contests its history so ferociously as America. Indeed, the history wars that play out at school boards now are almost on the level of the guns debate and the abortion debate. That just doesn't happen in other countries.
Isn't that healthy, though, that history debate? Because you can see the legitimacy of both arguments. I mean, leaving aside the extremes here, but both sides have a point, and arguing about it at school boards is exactly what Tocqueville saw as American democracy. The ability for ordinary Americans, as opposed to people in the House of Lords or other elites, to actually seize their own history and shape it accordingly.
I think one of the problems at the moment, though, and I go back to 1984, one of the things that struck me about arriving in the States was how future-focused it was. Remember that opening ceremony in the 1984 LA Olympics when that spaceman, sort of with a rocket pack on his back, zoomed into the LA Coliseum?
Yeah, and then there was, of course, the Apple ad, the famous 1984 Apple ad.
Yeah, and it was a country that was just so unafraid about its future because, frankly, back then there was more consensus about its past. There was this grand narrative of US history that it had been a story of progress and advancement. That really was the storyline back then. I remember going to Disneyland and watching this amazing presentation. It was an American journey that sort of took you in this multi-screen way, in a fabulously Disney way, with a happy beginning, a middle, and an end. It was a kind of Mickey Mouse version of American history, really, that was so triumphant and joyous and celebratory. And do you know which bit of the park it was based in? It was based in Tomorrowland, which didn't seem anomalous because America was just so confident about its future there because, the past was in the past almost. The past is not in the past at the moment. It's actually sort of making America captive. I think, Lincoln once said in 1862, we cannot escape our history. And I think that's one of the problems right now. America's finding it difficult to sort of leap into the future because it's still dealing with so much unresolved history from the past.
And yet, Nick, I'm talking to you from San Francisco on the edge of Silicon Valley, Tomorrowland, to borrow your word or Disney's word, where virtual reality and AI and the internet, all these things have been invented over the last 25 years that are going to shape the future. So it's not as if America has stood still. Parts of it have, parts of it look back. And yet in Palo Alto, in the South Bay, where I am, America is steaming into the 21st century.
Yeah, look, I spent a year as a visiting scholar at MIT, having spent my university education in Britain in some ancient universities. And I just felt like I was in the academic cutting edge. You know, I felt like I was in the place that kind of almost invented the future. I mean, MIT was crucial in the space race. It was crucial in the development of the internet, all those kind of things. And I saw that, the kind of white hot technology. And certainly you get that on the West Coast as well. And, you know, we were saying earlier that it's these pockets that you find that are still keeping America in the game, really. You know, the innovative nature of Silicon Valley, the powerhouse universities. Some of the great companies in America, obviously, but the politics is very different, and the civil discourse is very different. I mean, also, you know, America hasn't been particularly good at using technology to improve itself. I mean, you look at some of the writing around the internet when it first came into play, and I know you've written a lot about this. There was a real utopianism around it, this idea that there'd be this civil square online that we could all come into, and it would promote democracy. It would be a great space where we could discuss ideas in a civil way. And it's just turned out to be the complete opposite. And maybe, you know, there was some mistakes made in that era. I always thought that, you know, Bill Clinton spoke about building a bridge to the 21st century, but for a lot of people, the digital economy was more like a bypass that went past their communities in these post-industrial towns in the Rust Belt. He decided not to regulate the internet. He thought that Silicon Valley would be self-regulatory. And I mean, I think a lot of mistakes were made then in terms of how to cope with the future. And I think America's still suffering from that today.
We're speaking with Nick Bryant, the author of The Forever War, fascinating, important new book by one of America's great observers, lovers, and perhaps someone who is a little uncomfortable now with its current state, America's unending conflict with itself. I want to remind everyone that great guests like Nick are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties, a wonderful new quarterly on culture and politics, edited by Leon Wieseltier in Washington, D.C. Going to run a short feature on Liberties. And then I want to come back with Nick to talk about the 90s and the last 20 years and the rise of Trump and his feelings about the future of American democracy. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. Much advised. We are speaking with Nick Bryant, the author of The Forever War, longtime BBC man in Washington, D.C. Nick, let's fast forward. We talked about the 1970s before the break. Let's talk about the 90s. You were here in the 90s. We did a show recently with Terry Anderson, Why the 90s Matter. And I got an upcoming show with John Gantz, who has a new book out called When the Clocks Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. Mm-hmm. Was the Forever War that you write about, did it become more intense in the 90s? Is that where we should begin to date?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I'm looking at those books and thinking, I wish I'd written those books, but I get into the 90s a lot in my book as well. Look, I think the 90s were fascinating. It was this kind of unipolar moment for America, but it also was a moment that saw a lot of polarization at home. I think a couple of things happened. You know, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall. You had the victory over communism. The Cold War had actually imposed a discipline on Washington politics. There was a spirit of patriotic bipartisanship. Sure, the parties disagreed with themselves, but nowhere near the extent that they do now. and there were people who would come together and fashion out the bipartisan deals on Capitol Hill. Washington functioned far more smoothly. But when the Soviet Empire fell, that common enemy disappeared, and a lot of that patriotic partisanship just fell apart. And simultaneously, Andrew, what you had was a generational shift in American politics as well. Members of the greatest generation, comrades in arms during World War II, people who knew what it was like to fight a real war, were replaced by people of the baby boomer generation whose formative political years had been spent in the culture wars of the 1960s. And they were far more combative in their politics. People like Newt Gingrich, of course, on the Republican side, people like Bill Clinton on the Democratic side. And of course, Newt Gingrich comes along and he says, hang on a minute, the Republicans haven't been in control of the House of Representatives. We haven't had the Speaker's chair for about 40 years now. So this bipartisanship is actually punishing us. Every time we do a deal with the Democrats, it benefits them. It doesn't benefit us. It's going to keep us in permanent opposition. So Newt Gingrich decided basically to declare political war. So in this moment of triumph for American democracy, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Union, a lot of the roots of the present day polarization are found.
I know you're, like so many observers, troubled by the events of January 6th, the potential violence. But in terms of your thesis about this forever war, were in the 90s more dangerous? You had the Oklahoma City bomb killing hundreds of people. You had major standoffs between the FBI and all sorts of militarized right-wing groups. Today seems a rather pale comparison with what's happening or what happened in the 1990s.
I disagree. I think the 1990s were really worrying. You know, as you said, there was a lot of militia activity. You had that dreadful bomb in Oklahoma City in 1995. I mean, what happened after that is similar to actually what's happened after January the 6th, which was the FBI and the law enforcement agencies have really sort of decapitated the leadership of a lot of these militia groups, and it's had a dampening effect. I think in the 90s, politics was still, it wasn't sensible, but it wasn't as crazy as it is now. You didn't have the kind of destructive effect of the internet. You didn't have a destructive demagogue who was so norm-busting as Donald Trump. Indeed, you know, the Republican candidate in 2000 was a pretty traditional Republican, somebody who seems very moderate now. And that, of course, was George W. Bush. And if George W. Bush hadn't have got the Republican nomination, John McCain would have got the Republican nomination. So, you know, politics was more sensible then. It was becoming more crazy, but it was still a lot more sensible than it is now. And, you know, January the 6th was just an awful event. And I don't think something like January the 6th could have happened in the 1990s because there wasn't a leader like Trump who was prepared to incite it with the measure of power that Trump had at that time.
Your penultimate chapter in the new book is called Toxic Exceptionalism. You just wrote an interesting piece entitled "We Live in an Age of Toxic American Exceptionalism." In terms of your interpretation, is it just the Republicans who have gone wrong? I know you're I don't know if you're a big fan of Joe Biden, but Joe Biden's a big fan of you. He reads your books. When he came to office, he had one of your books, When America Stopped Being Great, on his reading stand. He seems the most normal, the least toxic of people. Perhaps that's part of his problem. Is it just one side of the political aisle, Nick, that's gone wrong, that's gone toxic, that's gone rogue here?
No, I don't think it is, to be honest. I think the Democrats have contributed often to the obstructionism on Capitol Hill that has caused so much gridlock, that has caused so much frustration with Washington, and the frustration with Washington partly explained the rise of Donald Trump, an outsider who could go in there and shake things up and try and make things work. In many ways, of course, he made things worse. But I do think the obstructionism of the Republicans, especially during the Obama years, was toxic. You know, people like Mitch McConnell really set out to make Obama a one-term president. The idea of a kind of patriotic bipartisanship just didn't work. And I think also, you know, this attack on democracy that we've seen from frankly, from the 1965 voting rights onwards, but which really gathered speed at the end of the 90s and in the early part of the 21st century. I mean, that really was a Republican assault because, frankly, they didn't want a lot of voters of color to be turning out of the polls. So they brought in all these voter ID laws. They tried to limit the size of the electorate. A smaller electorate, they believe, would help them. And I think the Republicans obviously have the lion's share when you talk about the toxicity of American politics. But I agree. I mean, the Democrats have contributed to a certain extent as well.
A lot of people have said that you understand America as well as any American, but one of the chapters in your book is In Guns We Trust, which is in some ways critical of the American obsession with guns. Some people might read that, some Americans, some gun rights people, maybe not even hardliners, and say, well, this guy just doesn't get us. We love our guns. We're not obsessed with murdering other people. Is the gun issue, Nick, one of the core reasons for this forever war, which is perhaps now threatening the future of America?
Yeah, look, I get why people love their guns, and I get people's. I mean, I really try and contextualize the gun debate in this book and go back to the very beginning. But I talk about how the gun culture is very mythic in many ways. It was an invention of the American firearms industry. They needed a love story. They needed to make people fall in love with their guns outside of wartime, when their sales always dipped. And they came up with a kind of Wild West, and they portrayed the Wild West as wilder than it really was. And of course, in more recent times, the NRA has come up with this new version of the Second Amendment, really. I mean, the Second Amendment became known as the Forgotten Amendment because it was primarily to do with militias. And when the need for militia groups at the state level rescinded, and there was a standing army that America had, you know, the Second Amendment didn't seem to apply anymore. And it was kind of redundant for many years. And of course, the Supreme Court always said it was a collective right rather than an individual right. And what the NRA has tried to do over the last 50 years, of course, is to to emphasize the individualistic interpretation. And they succeeded with that, of course, in 2008 in the Heller ruling, where the Supreme Court, for the first time, said that the Second Amendment underscored the individual right to bear arms. So I really try and contextualize that. I understand people's devotions to guns. I understand how the AR-15 has become a symbol in many ways of modern day gun culture, and also a way of sort of giving the middle finger to democratic America. A lot of the sales, it's sort of driven by the fact that it's the weapon that Democrats most want to ban. So no, I think I sort of understand the gun culture, but it's one of the core reasons for the toxic exceptionalism. I mean, there was a terrible attack 5 minutes away from where I'm sitting right now in Bondi in Sydney at a shopping centre a couple of months ago, where it was a knife attack, and it was awful, and it was targeted against women. It was absolutely terrible. But a lot of people said afterwards, thank God we don't live in America, and thank God the knifeman didn't have an AR-15. And the gun culture and the mass shootings is contributing so much to this idea of American toxic exceptionalism, and why so many countries are sort of trying to protect themselves in many ways against Americanization.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece in response to Alex Garland's new movie about, excuse me, I'm trying to find it. Civil War is a movie. If Trump wins, will it be a reality? There's a eerie film, a chilling film. We've done some shows about it, and it spoke of an America so armed, and an America of enormous kinds of violence. Is it conceivable, Nick, that this gun issue will ever get resolved?
The Civil War question, I think, is really interesting, because pessimistic as I am about America, and like you say, my love affair has faded to a certain extent. There's still a deep love, I promise you. But on the question of Civil War, I'm actually a bit more hopeful. There isn't the same geographic divide as there was in the 1860s. There isn't the same single issue divide. There's a whole swathe of issues that divide America right now. And in terms of the potential of a civil war, I think that actually has a dampening effect. I mean, we talk about red and blue America, but as you know, some of the red states have a lot of blue blobs in them. Take Texas. We often think of Texas as the reddest of the red, but its four major cities are run by either Democrats or an independent: Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin. And so I'm quite hopeful that there won't be a civil war. Again, the response to January the 6th and the way that a lot of the militia leadership is now imprisoned or on trial, I think that's been helpful. That's had a dampening effect. But although I don't think America necessarily will erupt into civil war, what I don't think, Andrew, is that it will reach a state of civil peace. And that's why I call this the forever war. That's why I call this America's unending conflict with itself.
Yeah, well, you will. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stephen Marsh, another old friend of mine, a Canadian who believes America's already in civil war. One of the other chapters in the new book, Nick, is entitled "Roe, Wade, and the Supremes." Isn't that quote unquote war between pro and anti-abortion people? Isn't that in itself also healthy? It's such a complicated issue in religious and philosophical terms that if a country is not in forever war over abortion, it's probably not a healthy place.
Well, it's the way that debate has been conducted. I mean, often violently at times in the 1980s and the 1990s, and now in such an incredibly divisive way where, the possibility of reaching any kind of consensus over that has gone. And you have got basically two Americas when it comes to abortion now, states where, women still have their reproductive rights and places where they don't. And again, it makes the idea of a United States of America almost oxymoronic. I mean, it sounds like a phrase that just doesn't apply to the country anymore. The very, name of the country doesn't actually sum up the country anymore. This is the disunited States of America, and few things exemplify that more than abortion. And again, it speaks of the kind of ongoing battle over the past. I mean, in many ways, overturning Roe versus Wade was a return to the 1970s. It was turning the clock back. And, you look at these protests with pro-choice and, those placards that some of the older women carry, were protesting this stuff in the 1970s. I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit. That poster that's become a kind of a meme. And it speaks again of this unresolved history. I mean, the New York Times, in its reporting of Roe versus Wade, I mean, it was kind of interesting. It actually happened the same day that LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, died. And the New York Times sort of split its front page between Johnson's death and overturning Roe versus Wade. And the coverage of the Times that day basically said, this matter is settled. What was interesting about the Times coverage as well, it didn't include any evangelical Christians. This wasn't a big issue for evangelical Christians back then. It was a huge issue for Roman Catholics. And liberal Democrats like Ted Kennedy, for instance, he was opposed to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So the politics of abortion have completely changed over the last sort of 40 years or so. But the big mistake in their coverage that day was to say the matter's settled now. Abortion is something that we agree on. That wasn't the true, obviously, and we're still fighting that now.
To bring the country back together to end this forever war, Nick, we've done many shows on this, is there a need for constitutional reform of the Electoral College, reform of the Supreme Court, fundamental rereading or rethinking of the Constitution? A lot of people are calling now for another constitutional convention. Is the crisis so deep, leaving aside Trump because he sucks all the energy, all the oxygen out of the room? Do you think for America to continue to be great, or at least semi-great, it needs to rethink its constitution?
Yeah, look, I've always thought it's needed to rethink its constitution, but then you're going to be careful what you wish for. A lot of conflict is often resolved through power sharing, and dysfunctional though the constitution is at the moment, it gives power sharing. The Democrats have got the White House at the moment.
Yeah, it's the Madisonian understanding of democracy. We're not angels and we needed divided government. So maybe it works.
Well, I don't think it works because it leads to so much dysfunction at the moment. And this is a problem. You can't live with the Constitution. You can't live without it. I mean, imagine if you got rid, for instance, of the Electoral College. The Democrats would basically have a hold on the White House, right? I mean, they've won the popular vote in 7 out of the last presidential elections. Imagine if you got rid of the malapportionment of the Senate, where, South Dakota gets exactly the same number of senators as California, how would the rural states that are awash with so many guns cope with that? So I think this actually perfectly exemplifies the problem that America faces right now. It can't live with the Constitution and it can't live without the Constitution.
Sounds like most marriages, Nick. Can't live with your wife, you can't live without.
But I mean, America isn't a very happy marriage right now, is it? I mean, that's the problem. It's a broken marriage, if it was a marriage ever in the first place.
Your afterword is about goodbye, America, but for you, in a different kind of way, you're living in Australia now. It's still hello, America. You wrote a very emotional letter to your newborn daughter on June 2020 when you still lived in New York. Can you yourself, and you have your own sort of complicated love affair with America, can you, even though you're in Australia now, can you personally, Nick Bryant, can you get beyond America?
No, I mean, my mind hasn't migrated yet. I live in Australia, but I still read the New York Times and the Washington Post first thing in the morning. You know, when I watch television news, I'm watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox News. I mean, in response to the Trump verdict, it was like watching the forever war from my sofa. You could switch between the battle lines going from MSNBC to Fox News with the remote control. I have a deep love of America. That letter that I wrote to my daughter 4 years ago was about her birth, and her birth
it reads wonderfully. It deals with Black Lives Matter and COVID. I would suggest everyone read it. I'm going to read a little bit. You gulped your first lungfuls of air as protesters across America chanted, "I can't breathe." Your daughter's going to read, when she can read, she's going to read this with a great deal of emotion.
Oh, I can't remember writing it. It was such a blur, but yeah, that kind of piece went viral. And I think because it summed up a lot of people's thoughts about America, a country that they love so deeply, and they were feeling very melancholic about it. And I was too. And, you know, we ultimately decided to leave America because we thought it wasn't a particularly brilliant place to raise our kids anymore. Our older kids realized why they were doing these drills at school. They were the mass shooter drills. They were the drills where they sort of shut the doors and turn off the lights and hide under their desks. In their early years, they were told it was a kind of game. They were told it was for a hurricane, but it was for a hail of bullets, of course. And that's what they came to realize. And we wanted to get them out of that. And yeah, I mean, it's tragic for me that I actually haven't been back to America since I left. And I've never gone a year of my life, Andrew, my adult life, without being in the States. And
so what year did you leave?
Well, we left in 2021, so it's 3 years now.
Wow.
I haven't been back. And like I say, I've never gone this long without being in America. And it's not a rejection of America. I love it still, but America hasn't got the magnetic pull for me that it once had.
Finally, Nick, you were the BBC guy there. A lot of people see you as one of the great BBC correspondents. You've even been described as the BBC's finest foreign correspondent, and the new Alistair Cook. Of course, the old Alistair Cook was an iconic figure, the author of Letter from America, which ran for about 60 years. How has media changed? You were an example of an old-fashioned BBC correspondent. You had an office, you had a title. These days, you'd probably be doing a podcast or being on X. How do you think the changes in media, the internet, social media, everything going real time, changes things? Are you in the camp that argues that democracy is being undermined by the digital revolution?
Oh, like I said before, I think in 2000 there was so much utopianism around how the internet would actually benefit democracy, and I do think it has had a very kind of corrosive effect. I was there really for the Big Bang. I mean, my first experience of covering America for the BBC was during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. We should really have called it the Bill Clinton scandal, but of course that story was broken by Drudge. Newsweek had it, but it was Drudge that broke the story. You had old-style journalists who were filing stories online for the first time. In fact, some of them didn't even have access to the internet at that stage. I didn't. And it was an extraordinary time. We had been the gatekeepers of news organizations like the BBC, like the Washington Post, like the New York Times. And Drudge reminded us how the internet had basically said, you're no longer the gatekeepers of news. In fact, there are no longer any gates. And that's been one of the biggest changes in the industry over the years, of course. We're no longer the people that people automatically come for at times of breaking news. They go to Twitter, they go to Facebook, they go to things like Fox News, which really found its home in that kind of impeachment year for Bill Clinton. The speed of news has become crazy. I think we often talk about 24/7 news. I think under Trump, it felt like 25/8. It was just absolutely bonkers. And we're dealing with politicians right now who almost become one-man media conglomerates themselves. I mean, that's what Trump became. He didn't need us. And actually, we ended up amplifying his message anyway. Massive changes in the media, massive changes in terms of misinformation out there, massive challenges in terms of how you debunk it or you pre-bunk it. It's a real problem. The information climate is so different. And, I think we have an infodemic at the moment, this problem of fake news and fake history. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to write the book as a sort of challenge to a lot of the fake history and the myth making that we've seen, especially in recent times.
Finally, Nick, Bryant, let's fast forward a year, July 2026, actually a couple of years. America will be celebrating its 250th anniversary. Two questions on that. Firstly, is the country going to make it? You've already kind of answered that one. And secondly, should we be celebrating? And thirdly, perhaps, what should America be looking for in the next 50 years?
Oh, I hope there'll be something to celebrate. I mean, the achievements of America are extraordinary, and that should be a cause of celebration. But I sense that, the 250th anniversary will be a moment where the history wars become even angrier. And it won't be possible to celebrate the idea of a United States of America. Again, that phrase just sounds oxymoronic now to me. How do we move forward? I constantly try and look for positive signs. I think you need an economy that works for everybody. I mean, if you look at political polarization, one of the reasons is economic polarization, income polarization. There's this kind of missing middle in American politics, partly because there's a missing middle in the American economy. You've got to find a way to do that. I'm hopeful of the kind of 9/11 generation of lawmakers that was coming through. Again, people who'd fought real wars, so they didn't necessarily feel they needed to fight political wars in Washington. But that younger generation seems, to be quite radical. So I don't see a return to the sort of patriotic bipartisanship that we saw during the Cold War. Would a war with China bring it about? Well, I don't know. I mean, some of the national crises that America's faced in the 21st century, like 9/11, brought about a fleeting moment of national unity, but then the arguments erupted again over the forever wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. Coronavirus could have been a time when the Americas came together because they were faced with this sort of national emergency. But again, you had these bitter rows over lockdowns and bitter rows over vaccination and things like that. I just can't see what brings this nation together. I hope something will. But as I say, even though I don't think it'll descend into civil war, I just can't see it being in a state of civil peace.